is equivalent to the SU2 diagonal. And now you can count the dimension of this coset space. So SO4 is a number of, let's say, rotation in 4 dimensions. So that's actually equal to 6, right? So the dimension of SO4 is equal to 6, which is 1/2 of 4 times 3, 6. Which is also the dimension of SU2, which is 3, times SU2, and plus SU2, which is 6. And SO3, or SU2, is a dimension 3. So clearly from this coset, we do expect actually 3 Goldstone bosons. And something that I kind of explained is that this Goldstone boson actually can describe really this longitudinal component of the W of this. So that was the agreement in the counting of degrees of freedom. So what I want to emphasize is that really those 3 Goldstone bosons, or those longitudinal components of the W and the Z, are really the relevant degrees of freedom when you look at the theory at high energy. And I want to give you some evidence of this statement, by looking at various processes where you will really see that what matters at high energy is the longitudinal degrees of freedom, and you can neglect the transverse polarizations. Transverse polarizations are just a small perturbation that don't really matter. And for that, I will look at least 3 processes, 3 relevant processes, and we will see that one of them will really indicate that there should be new physics beyond this longitudinal polarization. So the first thing that I want to discuss actually is the decay of the top quark. And in the standard model, the decay, the top quark decays almost 100% of its time into a W and a B quark. So now there is a question of actually what is a fraction of the longitudinal polarization in this decay. So here you can, in principle, you can really look at the various polarizations. So you will decay to the transverse polarization, transverse W, or the longitudinal polarization. And I want to compute the decay width for the 2 types of polarization. So let's say in the unitary gauge, so using the Feynman rules that you have certainly learned at some point, or you have seen, that you will see in the future for the standard model. So at the end, there is, at 3 levels, there is a simple contribution to this decay. It's very simple, but it is the top quark, the bottom quark, and the W. So here it's only the gauge vertex, so it's very simple. There is maybe some subtleties if you introduce some flavor physics, so there is a mixing between the different quarks. So the expression that I wrote this morning for the current was built in total analogy with QED, where there is no mixing at all among the different generations of quark and lepton. And the same is also true, let's say, for the leptonic current associated to the W. For the hadronic current, so the way the W coupled to the quark is a little bit more subtle. There is this CK matrix, this Kabimo-Kobayashi-Maskawa matrix, that in principle can really mix the different families of the quarks among themselves in the interaction with the W. But actually, if you look at the constraint, the CK matrix that really makes the bottom and the top is almost 1 in this case. So we can neglect this mixing among the generation for the first generation. Okay, so this means that here it's simply actually the gauge coupling that enters into this vertex. So you can compute explicitly now this Feynman diagram. Okay. I won't do that in details because it's a little bit cumbersome. You need to introduce this first of all the polarization vector. For the gauge bosons, you need here to introduce epsilon mu. And here you also need to introduce these Dirac spinors that describe the fermion into these diagrams. So at the end of the day, what you will get is a simple result that the decay width of the top into the transverse polarization of a W is equal to G squared divided by 16.4 pi, which is just the phase space. Right? And then there is a factor that is telling you that this decay width is just vanishing when you're on threshold, divided by m top. So somehow is what you will expect, I mean, just by dimension analysis, right? So the decay width at the dimension of a mass, right? So mass to the fourth divided by mass, so it's mass, that's correct. Is proportional to g squared, okay, which you can understand by looking at the diagram, or you can also understand the dependence in the gauge coupling just by counting actually the dimension in h bar. You know? So when we're doing theoretical physics, you know, everybody is usually very happy to put h bar equal 1, c equal 1.
Christopher, fine. And of course, neglecting g-corp mass.
Yeah.
Comparing to other mass.
Absolutely. That's this result in the limit of the mass of the bottom equal to 0. Yeah, so I was saying that usually in theoretical physics, you know, the first thing that you do, just to avoid any mistake, is to put h bar equals c equal 1, right? That's fine because, okay, everything has the dimension of the mass, you know, energy. And in this unit, the gauge coupling is just a dimensionless number. So at the end of the day, you know, you have no way, at the end, just by doing dimensional analysis, to know what is the power dependence on the gauge coupling. So this you have to compute, or you have to look at the Feynman diagram. But actually, sometimes it's useful to remember that h bar is not a dimensionless number. It is an axion. So it has the mass of an energy times the time. Right? So h bar is not a dimensionless number, is really energy times time. And if you remember that h bar has a dimension, you will actually understand that g has also a dimension. Actually, g, or the gauge coupling, the dimension of the gauge coupling has the dimension of h bar to minus 1/2. That's really important because you can now exactly understand what is the dependence on the gauge coupling in an amplitude or decay width just by looking at the h bar dimension of the vector. So this will explain, for instance, why you have g squared and not g cubed, for instance. G cubed wouldn't make this quantity dimensionally correct in h bar dimension. So I've prepared a little exercise when you can look into the details of the h bar dimension of the various fields, the various couplings, and you will understand a lot of things. So for instance, I mean, just as a curiosity, since I'm starting to discuss this, in supersymmetry, in the MSSM, there is a prediction for the X quartic in terms of the gauge coupling. And you find this mysterious relation that G is proportional to G squared. And lambda, the quartic X coupling, is equal to G squared. And again, you know, you can understand this particular relation looking at the h bar dimension. Because lambda has really the h bar dimension, which is h bar to minus 1, which is equivalent to the gauge coupling squared. So you can understand where those relations are coming from only purely by dimensional analysis. So that's very powerful things to remember. So sometimes, yeah, when you're doing the computation, you should put h bar equal 1, but at the end of the day, try to get back and look at the h bar dimension, and you will check whether your result also makes sense dimensionally. So it's very useful. Okay, let me close the parenthesis here and write the expression for the decay width of the top into this longitudinal polarization system. So it will be very similar g squared over 64 pi m top over m w squared times mt minus mw squared So let us stare at those expressions for a moment in two different limits. Right? So first of all, you can look at threshold. So what does it mean at threshold? It means that when the top have just enough energy to actually decay into a W and a B. Right? So this means that in the limit where the mass of the top is almost equal to the mass of the W, since I'm neglecting the mass of the B. In this case, okay, this ratio here is equal to 1. And what you notice is that the decay width into the transverse is just twice the decay width into the longitudinal polarization. So the decay width of, let's say, longitudinal is 1/2 of the decay width into transverse polarization. Right? Which is something that we expected because I told you, at rest, so basically when you're at threshold, this means that the mass of the top is equal to the mass of the W, so it means that you're emitting the W without energy, right? So you have a top which is at rest, it decays into a W that doesn't carry any kinetic energy, right? So the W is at rest. And if it's at rest, there is no distinction between longitudinal and transverse polarization. And since you have two transverse polarization and one longitudinal polarization, you explain this factor 2. So that's very clear. Now, what is interesting is when you go to very high energy. So at high energy, so high energy for the W, right? So I want to consider the case where the W is produced with a lot of kinetic energy. So this means that I need to consider the limit where the mass of the top is much larger than the mass of the W. Mass of the top much larger than the mass of the W. And then you notice that in this expression, in this case, the longitudinal decay width is actually much larger than the decay width into transverse polarization. So this means that physically, you can put this equal to 0, and all the top decays actually in the longitudinal polarization. In this case, decay width into longitudinal polarization is much larger by this amount, this factor here, compared to the transverse polarization. Right? So this is telling you that in the high energy limit, the relevant degrees of freedom for the W is only the longitudinal polarization, and you can totally neglect this transverse polarization. The transverse polarization doesn't play any role, it's just a small perturbation. Right? So this was done, in the unitary gauge. This computation is obtained in the unitary gauge by looking really at the W. Now I want to tell you that actually you can understand exactly this result by looking at the Goldstone boson, right? So I say that there is this Goldstone boson that are associated to the breaking of this global symmetry, and I want to see that in the high energy limit, really, you can understand this decay width by replacing this longitudinal polarization of the W by the Goldstone boson. So where do I get this interaction between, let's say, the top, the bottom, and the Goldstone boson? So the Goldstone boson, at the end of the day, is part of the Higgs doublet, right? So I need to look at an interaction between the top, the bottom, and some element of the Higgs doublet. So where in the standard model Lagrangian do I get such an interaction? In the Yukawa interaction, absolutely. So in the Yukawa interaction, you are writing something which is, let's say, Q left that contains the top and the bottom, so that transforms as a doublet under SU2. So that's top, bottom, left. And then you're writing the X field, and then you have this top right. And this is the Yukawa interaction, so it's proportional to the Yukawa coupling. Maybe there is a dagger somewhere. I don't know if it's H or H dagger, it doesn't matter. It's something that makes these things invariant on SU2 cross U1. So when the X is taking expectation value, this actually reproduces the top mass. Right? Because, this becomes a constant, and here you are taking the lower component, and in order to make the things invariant, actually the lower component that takes the valve actually coupled to the top. Right? So you have top left, the valve of the X, that top right. So this is exactly the mass of the Higgs boson, right? The mass of the top quark. So this is producing Y top and V square root of 2 because of the value of the Higgs times top left, top right, right? Plus Hermitian conjugate. So this is the mass of the top. So M top is simply Y top V divided by square root of 2.
Christopher, to be more precise, top left direct conjugate.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. You need to put the bars, and then okay, you need to go into the details, you know, the fermions, etc. So you can write actually the two component spinor formalism, and then you can neglect all the bars.
In principle, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so that's actually, you know, the way you introduce the masses for the quark and the lepton in the standard model, yeah? Because the mass for the fermion is something that really mixes the two chiralities of the fermion, right? The mass term for fermion is always a combination of left-handed chirality with right-handed chiralities, right? And of course, in the standard model, you know, you are not allowed to write such a mass term by hand because the two things don't transform in the same way, right? So the right-handed top is a singlet on the SU2 left, while the left-handed top is a doublet of SU2. So this mass term wouldn't be invariant under SU2 cross U1. So that's why the way to generate the masses is through the Higgs interaction, right? This is an operator which is invariant under SU2 cross U1 because it's a doublet times a doublet that form a singlet under SU2. And also the U1 hypercharge of such a way that the hypercharge of this combination is equal to 0. So if you want, the Higgs mechanism, the Higgs field is really there to be able to give a mass to a theory which is chiral. Right? So the standard model, that's one of the big properties of the standard model. The standard model is a chiral theory. Chiral means really that left-handed and right-handed chirality of the fermion don't transform in the same way under the gauge symmetry. And as long as chiral symmetry is exact, then the mass of all the quarks of the lepton has to vanish. So the way you break chiral symmetry is, in this sense, is via the Higgs doublet. In this sense. Thanks to the Higgs, you are able really to give a mass to the fermion that are chiral. Right? Because of course, this is perfectly allowed by U1 of electromagnetism, right? U1 of electromagnetism, so contrary to U1 electromagnetism, also contrary to QCD, which is SU3. These are vector-like theory, right? So they are vector-like theory because, again, the left-handed and the right-handed chirality of the fermion transform in the same way. Right? When you have learned QED for the first time, nobody has been telling you that there were a left-handed electron and the right-handed electron. Right? Everything was introduced by hand at the same time. So you introduce the electron as a Dirac fermion, and there is a single charge for the left-handed chirality and the right-handed chirality. So that's exactly what we're saying, that QED is vector-like. And that's why, you know, there is no problem in QED to introduce the mass of the electron. Right? But for the standard model, you need to go through the Higgs because the standard model is a chiral theory. And this has important consequences. For instance, if you try to, you know, to embed the standard model or try to extend the space-time with extra dimension. So you could say, for instance, okay, we are living in four-dimensional world, right? But maybe there is some extra dimension in the universe. We don't know. That's a possibility. The issue is that if you try to compactify, you know, naively some extra dimension on a smooth manifold, then you will automatically get a vector-like theory, not a chiral theory. So in order to generate chirality in 4 dimensions, you need to compactify on manifolds that have some singularities. So like orbifold compactification, for instance. So an orbifold is just a manifold with some boundaries. And then in this way, you can actually introduce chirality in 4 dimensions. So that's always something that you have to remember. Standard model one of the big properties of the standard model is this chirality. So the fact that left-handed and right-handed components of the fermion don't transform in the same way. Okay, so let me come back again now to what I'm discussing. The
We
decay.
are like it that chiral anomalies go away, right? Cancel out each other.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Another story, yes. That's also an exercise that we can discuss later, this anomaly cancellation. Okay, so that was, in the vacuum. But now you can also keep track of the ghost on boson that belong to the X doublet, right? Instead of going into the unitary gauge where the ghost on boson are eaten and become directly the longitudinal component, now I'm computing in another gauge where actually we'll keep explicitly the ghost on boson inside the X doublet. Then you could say, okay, I have Y top, I have Q left, which is top and bottom left. I have the X doublet, which is H plus and H0, right? Times top right. So now, so in this product, you have certainly top left, H0, top right, but you have also bottom left, H plus, top right. So this means that this contains a vertex, which is actually top, bottom, and the ghost stone, which is charged, which carries an electric charge +1, so H plus. And this vertex, is always proportional to Y top, right? Proportional to Y top. And Y top, this relation is actually related to the mass of the top quark. So now you can really do your computation with this vertex, right? Which is a much simpler theory than looking at this, because you don't have to deal with the different polarization, the polarization vectors, etc. So just have this. And here you can compute. You can compute directly the matrix element associated to this, right? So the matrix element squared will be 1/2, because you need to average over the polarization of the initial state, 1/2, times the vertex here, Y top squared, times the product of this U and V component of the spinors, which will give you an extra factor 1/2 times 4, the momentum of the top times the momentum of the bottom. It's just the usual Dirac algebra for the two fermions. So now, what can you do? So you can actually compute the momentum of the top and the momentum of the bottom. Let's say if you go to the rest frame of the top quark, right? So in the rest frame of the top quark, you will say that PT is simply the mass 0, 0, 0. And then what do you have? You have the momentum of the bottom. I choose a frame where the momentum is only in the z direction, and I look into the case where the mass of the bottom is also 0, so the energy is equal to the momentum. And at the end of the day, just by momentum conservation, you will realize that this quantity is simply equal to the factor 4 is simply equal to m top times m top squared minus mw squared divided by 2m top. And now that you have the matrix element squared, you can compute the decay width, and the decay width is equal simply to matrix element squared divided by the flux, right? 8 pi m top squared times, again, the momentum of the bottom quark, which is B in this case. And if you replace everything, use the algebra, you find that it's equal to G squared and 416 pi m top squared minus mw squared divided by B. So it was Y top. and y top is actually empty over V, right? So that's why you see this V appearing here. And now, in order to make the connection, you have to remember simply that the mass of the W is actually related to the vacuum expectation value of the X via the formula that we derived this morning, that the mass of the W squared is 1/4 G squared V squared. Right? So you can replace V squared by the mass of the W squared and G squared, and then there is a factor 4. And now I think that by comparing those results, it should agree, right? Maybe up to factor 2, okay. No, this factor 2. Maybe this factor 2 is not there. At least this computation here should exactly match this expression. So it's quite interesting in the sense that here, I've done the computation without knowing at all the gauge theory, right? So here you can do the computation, let's say, in the gaugeless limit, where you put all the gauge coupling to 0. The only interaction that you have at your disposal is this Yukawa interaction. And still you get the same result, right? So it's the two computations done in a totally different result that agrees, and they agree simply because in the high energy limit, indeed, this Goldstone boson is exactly describing this longitudinal polarization of the W. Okay, so that was the first example of this, what is called the Goldstone equivalence theorem. So the Goldstone equivalence theorem is really telling you that at high energy, when the W is very energetic, the longitudinal polarization is exactly equivalent to the Goldstone boson. So the second process that I want to discuss is actually the decay of the X into two W's, or two Z's. Doesn't matter. So in nature, I'm sure you have read somewhere that the mass of X is 125 GeV, plus or minus 0.2%, right? So it's really well known. The mass of the W is of the order of 80 GeV, so the mass of two W's is at least 180 GeV. So clearly, in nature, this decay is not allowed, right? So what we observe in nature is actually the decay of the X into one W, which is on shell, and then the other W, which is off shell. So there is not the decay into on shell pairs of gauge bosons. So the same is also true. That's one very important decay channel of the X. Z star, and the Z decays into 4 leptons. So that was one of the channels, that really convinced people that the Higgs boson exists, because they look at the production of 4 leptons, they reconstruct the invariant mass of the 4 leptons, and they see a peak that is really corresponding to the Higgs boson.
About 60. Just. You went already to the next example.
Since I'm recording, it's better to correct the mistake. 160. Plus or minus something. So what I want to say is that in nature, this decay channel in on-shell W or on-shell Z is not open, is not kinematically allowed, but we are doing theoretical physics, so I can, look at the deformation of the standard model and assume that the Higgs boson is actually much heavier than what it is in reality, and I want to look at the theory in this large X mass limit. Right? So we'll put myself into the regime that doesn't correspond to the reality, but I will put myself into the limit where the mass of the X is much larger than twice the mass of the W in order to see this decay. And in particular, if the mass is very large compared to the mass of the W, it means that the two W will carry a lot of kinetic energy. So again, in that limit, I should be able to see the behavior of the longitudinal polarization dominating over the transverse polarization. So that's what I want to check explicitly by the computation. So again, that's a computation that you can do, just applying some Feynman rules, right? And you can, again, look at the behavior of the transverse polarization and the longitudinal polarization. So here you find that mh cubed divided by 16 by v squared times 8 x to the 4 1 minus 4x squared, where x is actually the ratio of the mass of the W divided by the mass of the X boson. So it's supposed to be a small number, a small parameter. While for the longitudinal polarization, I won't find actually this x to the 4 suppression is something that will be simply a constant. V squared 1 minus 4 x squared plus 4x to the 4 1 minus 4 x squared. So again, I mean, this is just the phase space suppression. You know, when you are on shell, basically the decay width should vanish. So when x is equal to 1/2, this is exactly 0. So that's just the threshold behavior. But the important thing is really that the transverse polarization got this x to the 4 suppression, which is not present for the longitudinal polarization. So again, in the very energetic limit, you know, so in that limit here, the transverse polarization dominates over the longitudinal polarization, dominates over the transverse polarization. So that's the result of the computation, let's say, in the unitary gauge. And now again, you can reproduce this result by looking simply of the interaction of the Higgs boson with the Goldstone boson. Because in the high energy limit, all what matters should be the Goldstone boson. You can neglect the transverse polarization, and the longitudinal polarization really becomes the Goldstone boson. So where do I get this interaction between the Higgs boson and two Goldstone bosons? So where do I find such an interaction in the standard model Lagrangian? So you need really a vertex which is one Higgs boson and H, I want to draw it here, and two Goldstone bosons, so H plus and H minus. So is there such a term in the standard model Lagrangian? Such an interaction?
Expand the dynamical term to be there, right?
Which one, sorry?
If you expand the dynamical term for Higgs fields, it will be in there.
So
Right?
dynamical, what do you mean dynamical?
Covariant derivative over
The
Higgs.
covariant derivative, well, the covariant derivative is d mu h squared, right? So there is only two power of the gauge boson. And there is nothing like that involves free X field. Right? So look at this in the gaugeless limit. So put G and G prime to 0. Right? This covariant kinetic term is nothing else than d mu h squared, right? Which is quadratic in the field. So here I really need an interaction that involves at least 3 scalar fields. No idea? Well, you remember that I needed to introduce this X potential, right, to break or to give a vacuum expectation value to X. H squared minus V squared over 2 squared. And this contains higher power of the X field, right? At least 4 power. Right? These terms which are cubic and quadratic. Right? So this exactly contains, in principle, the thing that I'm interested in. So now you need, again, to look at the expansion of this X potential, keeping track of the Goldstone boson, right? Okay, so let me do it. So H is the value of the X. It's a normalization. Okay. I have the physical Higgs boson, H, plus, let's say, phi 0, which is a I phi 0, which is a Goldstone boson. And here is the same thing. You can write phi 1 plus I phi 2, phi will be 0. divided by 2. And then these pi 0, 1, and 2 are just the Goldstone boson. It's one parameterization of this Goldstone boson. So let us write the expansion of this X potential, keeping track of all these fields. So it's lambda, h squared is simply v plus h squared plus pi 0 squared plus pi 1 squared plus pi 2 squared minus v squared squared, and then I have here factor 4. Okay, so it's quite simple. At the end of the day, it's lambda over 4. So you expand this term, so the v squared cancel. So you have 2vh plus h squared plus pi 0 squared plus pi 1 squared plus pi 2 squared. And you take the square, with lambda over 4, 4 v squared h squared, which is the square of this term. And that's exactly what is giving you the mass of the Higgs boson, right? You have the Higgs potential, look like this, and now I'm looking at the expansion around this vacuum, right? So the linear term cancel because I am really in the minimum, and then I only have a quadratic term, and the quadratic term is the mass of the Higgs boson. Okay? So in addition to this mass term, now I have some terms which are cubic in the field, right? For instance, I have 4 v h times pi 1 squared plus pi 2 squared plus etc. etc. You can also look at the cubic interaction of the Higgs. 4 v h cube. And, okay, if you go to the complex notation, this should be actually 2 pi plus pi minus. So here, you have really identified the vertex with each h, pi plus pi minus, h plus h minus, this one. And the coefficient in front of this vertex interaction is really related to the quartic interaction. This is the only free parameter, and the quartic interaction is at the end of the day related to the mass of the Higgs boson. Right? So from there, you read that the mass of the Higgs boson squared should be 2 lambda v squared. Right? So lambda, the quartic interaction in the Higgs potential is actually proportional to the mass of the Higgs boson itself. So now, here, what you obtain is that this vertex, okay, 4 cancel, so you have 2, so that should be 2 lambda times v, right? And 2 lambda times v is nothing else than mh squared divided by v. That's the Feynman rules associated to this interaction of one Higgs boson with 2 Goldstone bosons. So now you can easily compute actually the decay of the Higgs into 2 Goldstone bosons is simply proportional to the square of this vertex, right? And then with the phase space, so it will be proportional to mh to the 4. With the phase space, etc., you will end up again into some expression. Now you can compute from that diagram, you can compute the decay of the Higgs into h plus h minus, or pi plus pi minus, if you want. Keeps changing the notation, will be in this case simply mh cubed divided by 16 pi, v squared simply because of the square of these things, and that's it. Which again agrees perfectly with the high energy limit of this of this computation in the unitary gauge. And again, I mean, it's really amazing computation, right? Because on one hand, I was doing everything in the unitary gauge, keeping track of all the gauge interaction. And on the other side, I've been able to derive this result almost without any effort, just by looking basically at this interaction in the gaugeless limit, where you have totally switched off all the gauge interaction, and the only interaction that really matters at the end of the day is really the interaction with the Bose bosons. And the two results agrees, of course, as expected by this Goldstone equivalence theorem. So that was really an important result to tell you that at high energy, so every time the kinetic energy of the W is much larger than its mass, then you can totally focus on the relevant degrees of freedom, which is the longitudinal polarization, and totally forget about this transverse polarization that are just there to make the theory beautiful and consistent with the symmetries or whatever, what you call the symmetry, which doesn't exist in nature. Okay? Just a way to keep track of all the degrees of freedom. Okay, so that's a very interesting result, because you can understand actually it can help you to really understand what is the high energy limit of the standard model. So what do you need basically to add in addition, let's say, to this longitudinal polarization of the W and the Z? So here, somehow, in particular in this computation, I've already assumed that the X exists, right? But the W was discovered in '82 at UA1 and UA2 at CERN, and people were wondering actually what are you going to find in addition to this W and Z, right? What is the extra degrees of freedom that you need to actually make the theory consistent? So by now, everybody assumed that there is a Higgs boson, but the Higgs boson was certainly not a granted object in the theory, right? You have to to build the theory from what you have observed. So you have observed a longitudinal polarization, and just by the symmetry of the gauge interaction, we have understood that actually at high energy, this longitudinal polarization of the W behave like a scalar field, right? So for sure we have this free Goldstone boson, but are we sure that you need something else in addition to this free Goldstone boson? That's the story. Why do we need the Higgs boson to make the theory consistent? And for that, you need actually to look at the scattering of this longitudinal component. So we have observed this longitudinal component of the W by the fact that the W and the Z have a mass, right? And we want to see how far you can extend, for instance, the effective description of this object that you have observed. In particular, I told you by looking explicitly, at the polarization vector that at high energy, this longitudinal polarization grows with the energy. So maybe there is something that is really interesting when you are looking at the scattering of this longitudinal polarization. So you look at WW, for instance, it could be W plus, W plus, W plus, W plus. I mean, there is various channels that you can look at. You can look at W plus, W minus. You can look at ZZ, WZ, etc. Let us focus on this one. So now, let us look at the behavior of this scattering amplitude. Right? So each of the legs here grows with the energy. I told you that there is some component of the polarization vector that grows with the energy. So each of the legs should grow like the energy divided by the mass of the W. And I have 4 legs, so you have 4 powers. And what is this vertex? Well, this vertex is simply the gauge coupling squared. It's just a non-abelian Yang-Mills theory, so this should simply be proportional to G squared. So you expect that the scattering amplitude for this process should grow like e to the 4th. And that's problematic, of course, because if you have an amplitude that grows with the energy, it means that when you are computing some cross-section, the cross-section will grow with the energy, and at some point, you will lose perturbative unitarity, that when you're computing some probability, the probability will be bigger than 1. So that's something that doesn't make sense. You cannot have an amplitude that grows with the energy up to arbitrarily high energy. Otherwise, you're losing probability conservation, etc. So certainly, you need some element to cancel this growth. Right? You need some new dynamics or some new degrees of freedom to cancel this growth. So from gauge theory, you know that there is a 4-point vertex interaction among the gauge boson, but you also know that there is actually a cubic interaction, right? So this means that there is other diagram that contribute to this scattering. Maybe now I should have put W minus. So W plus, W minus, then you can exchange a Z, a photon, W plus, W minus. Right? So what is the behavior of this scattering amplitude? Well, I have certainly a propagator here. So it's 1 over, let's say, S channel, so S squared or E squared minus the mass of the Z or the mass of the photon, which is equal to 0. That's just a propagator. And here I have a cubic interaction among 3 gauge boson. So this is proportional to G. And this is also a vertex that involves 1 derivative. Where is this cubic interaction coming from? It's always coming from F mu nu squared. Right? So that's the kinetic term to the gauge boson. And F mu nu is d mu a nu minus d nu a mu plus G times a mu, the commutator of a mu, right? Squared. That's what you need to make the theory invariant under local transformation. So clearly you have the quartic interaction when you're taking the square of this commutator, so that's the vertex here, but you have also some cubic interaction when you're taking the cross product of the derivative times this commutator. So this means that here the cubic vertex is actually proportional to 1 power of the gauge coupling, but it's also proportional to 1 derivative. So this means that I have 1 power of the momentum, which is 1 power of the energy. So you have here 1 power, the second power, because that's the square of the cubic vertex. So it should be G E squared. And again, I have this 4 polarization for the longitudinal component of the scattering process. Right? So it should be E over M to the 4. So again, when you are at high energy, you notice that here there is a cancellation between this energy term and the propagator. So you have the same energy behavior for this quartic interaction, the contact interaction, or the exchange of the Higgs boson. And actually, you can look in details, about the numerical factor that I haven't included here. And you will see, actually, due to the fact that the quartic interaction is simply the square of the cubic interaction, it's coming from this same vertex here, there will be actually an exact relation between this term G squared and this term G squared. And when you're summing the two, actually, E to the 4 terms exactly cancel with each other. So you add this interaction with this one, they cancel. So there is no term which is growing like E to the 4, but there will be term which is growing like E squared. So it's a subdominant piece, and this term unfortunately don't cancel with each other simply by looking at the gauge interactions. So say it in another way, if you give a mass by n to the W, you will always end up with scattering amplitude that grows again like G squared, E squared divided by the mass of the W squared, but there is no way to cancel these terms. So again, you are in trouble with perturbative unitarity, and actually this scattering amplitude will become larger than 1 or whatever at an energy which is simply related to the mass of the W divided by the gauge coupling. Actually, you can put some factor 4 pi. So that's the maximum energy at which actually the theory of a massive gauge boson makes sense. Above this energy, this description is not valid anymore, because when you are computing some perturbatively, when you are computing some scattering amplitude, you will get something that gives you some probability bigger than 1. So you know that before you're reaching this energy, you certainly need to introduce extra degrees of freedom. So again, you can simply reproduce this result, in particular, the term that grows like e squared, simply by looking at the self-interaction of the Goldstone boson. So how do I describe this Goldstone boson? Well, just by analogy with the pion in QCD, you want to introduce a matrix sigma that will transform, as G left times sigma times G right, and you write simply a kinetic term for this matrix. You write P squared over 4 trace of d mu sigma dagger d mu sigma. So in the unitary gauge, you can always say that sigma is equal to identity in such a way that this will simply reproduce actually the mass term for the W and the Z. This will be mW squared, W mu plus W mu minus, plus 1/2 the mass of the Z, Z mu squared. Because again, you can write the covariant kinetic term, which is d mu sigma plus I or minus and G W mu A sigma A over 2 times sigma plus same thing on the right for the U1 symmetry. So that's the result in the unitary gauge with sigma equal to 1. So now you can go into a different limit. Consider the case where actually, which is a gaugeless limit, so G prime goes to 0, and keep only actually the physical degrees of freedom in sigma, which are the pion. So you will say that sigma is just exponential of pi A sigma A divided by D. Now you have the free Goldstone boson, which is the Goldstone boson associated to the breaking of SO4 to SO3, or the breaking of SU2 left plus SU2 right down to SU2 diagonal. Exactly like the pion. So people use these things to describe the breaking of chiral symmetry in QCD, where you expect also the free pion, pi 0 and pi plus and minus, which have exactly the same symmetry property as this coset space in the electronic CD. So the only thing is that in QCD, you replace V by F pi. So QCD, the pion of QCD, V is actually replaced by F pi, which is 93 MeV or something. Okay. So what is this theory, right? So this theory is getting simpler in the gaugeless limit. So when you keep only the usual kinetic term, so the kinetic term is acting on this field, and now you can expand in power of pions, right? So you can say that this theory contains something which is, you start expanding this exponential. So you start with 1 identity plus I pi A sigma A divided by V, and then there is a squared also, so 1/2 pi A sigma A over V squared plus etc. etc. It's an infinite sum of power. So certainly here, this Lagrangian contains a term which is quadratic in the field, but it also contains term with more and more power of the pion field. Right? So it contains a kinetic term, and everything has been, this normalization factor has been chosen in such a way that when you try to expand this Lagrangian, you will find 1/2 d mu by A d mu by A. That's the usual kinetic term. But in addition, you will find some term that contain 2 derivatives and 4 power of the pions, plus d mu by 6, plus etc. etc. And this term, just by counting the number v, will be suppressed by v squared, 1 over v to the 4th, etc. So now you see that this Lagrangian contains a term, contact interaction among 4 pions, pi, 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 pi. And this interaction somehow has 2 derivatives, so it grows with the square of the energy. And just by looking at the dimension, it grows like e squared over v squared. And that's exactly what is reproducing this result again. So here we're looking at the scattering of this longitudinal polarization. You end up with a term which is growing like e squared, g squared divided by mw squared. Now you do your computation in a different model, by looking at the scattering of this Goldstone boson, and you get a result that grows like e squared divided by v squared, which is exactly the same result. And okay, the numerical factor that I didn't include here, there is some numerical factor due to this exponential, the expansion of this exponential, so simple geometrical factor, and if you do the computation, they exactly match. Right? Everything is consistent. But again, you are in trouble because this theory that describes really the Goldstone boson is valid only in a finite energy range. Right? So that's really the description of this longitudinal component of the W in an energy range which is above the mass of the W, so much larger than the mass of the W. And again, you are losing perturbativity at an energy which is 4 pi times the mass of the W divided by G. So that's the domain of applicability of your theory. So by the way, it makes sense. This range is not vanishing only because the gauge coupling is actually a small number, right? Such a way that 4 pi divided by G is large, and such a way that there is really an energy domain where this theory is applicable. If if the gauge coupling was strong, so G equal to 4 pi, then you will never be able to use this theory, right? For G equal 4 pi, this interval shrink, and there is no energy domain where you can actually describe the W in terms of this Lagrangian. But the question is really what is happening above this energy, right? That's something that we had no clue between LEP and the discovery of the Higgs boson 5 years ago. We have many ideas, and one idea was really the introduction of the Higgs boson, so an additional degrees of freedom on top of this longitudinal polarization. So how do you see the Higgs boson in this story? Right? So what is really the role of the Higgs boson? The Higgs boson is there to make sense of this longitudinal degrees of polarization by adding an extra contribution to the WW scattering amplitude. How do you obtain this? Yes. So in addition to this simple Lagrangian, I will now add an extra degree of freedom. So trace d nu sigma tiger into sigma. So that was simply the mass term for the W and the Z, right? So I will start by introducing an extra scalar field, we call H, that I will couple to this Goldstone boson. And if you want, you can also introduce, for some reason that will become clear, in a moment, you can introduce a quadratic term. So you have introduced by hand an extra scalar degrees of freedom with those particular interaction, so it's just some arbitrary coupling A and B, arbitrary coupling to the Ghouston boson. And now you want to compute the contribution of the exchange of the Higgs boson to the WW scattering amplitude. Right? So we have seen that this term here, the contact interaction, give you this pi scattering amplitude that goes with the energy. So this term which goes like S divided by V squared. S is a Mandelstam variable, so it's equal to E squared, let's say. And in addition now, we also have this new interaction. Right? You can exchange the Higgs boson. So let us compute this contribution to the scattering amplitude of the pion. Well, I have certainly one propagator of the Higgs boson, so it's 1 over S minus mh squared. And then again, I have this cubic interaction. Right? So this cubic interaction is proportional to A, this linear interaction. You see that we normalize A divided by B. But now I also have this, this derivative interaction with the Ghouston boson. Here it's growing like S. There are two derivatives growing like S. So at the end of the day, S A divided by B. And you can see, that in the high energy limit, when S is much larger than the mass of the Higgs boson, you get an extra contribution here that also grows like S. And at the end of the day, okay, there is an extra minus sign in such a way that when you're summing, everything is S divided by V squared minus A squared divided by V squared times S over S minus MH squared. S squared. Right? So this is S times S minus MH squared minus A squared S squared divided by V squared S minus MH squared. So you have a term which is S squared 1 minus A squared minus S MH squared divided by V squared S minus MH squared. So now you're in business, right? Because if you simply choose this particular coupling A to be equal to 1, you see that here you have a cancellation. The terms which are really growing with the energy are cancelling with each other between this contact interaction and the exchange of the Higgs boson. So for A equal 1, the scattering amplitude grows like S divided by S, so it remains constant. For A equal 1, this goes to a constant, and this constant is simply mh squared divided by V squared. So we are in business, right? You are restoring the consistency of the theory, or the perturbative expansion, simply by introducing a scalar field, and this scalar field needs particular coupling to the Ghouston boson, right? Particularly, it's a prediction that the coupling of the Higgs to the Ghouston boson, which at the end of the day is nothing else than the coupling of the Higgs to the W and the Z, are equal to 1 in this normalization. Right? So what you obtain is that the coupling of the Higgs to the W and the Z, remember that this, when you're writing here in terms of the unitary gauge, this is nothing else than the mass of the W and the Z. So the Higgs coupled to the W and the Z proportionally to their mass. So that's something that you have all learned, so that the Higgs coupling are proportional to the mass of the particle. So this is not an accident. This is really the property, the fundamental property that you need to make sure that the Higgs exchange restore perturbative unitarity. so we have fixed A equal 1 for the standard model. So now what about B? Well, here I've looked at pi-pi scattering, but actually now that I have introduced new particle, you can also look at inelastic channel, right? So for instance, you can look at pi-pi producing two Higgs bosons. Pi-pi producing two Higgs bosons. And this will be, in this case, proportional to B, and it will be again proportional to these derivative terms, right? So it will be proportional to S of B squared. And in addition to that, you will have a contribution which is coming from this from this linear interaction, right? So pi, x, and x. And this is proportional to B, no, to A squared. There is 2 power A squared, and then probably using the propagator again, so that's B squared plus minus B squared. And what you notice is that this scattering amplitude remains finite, provided that B is equal to A squared. Yeah, there is always a minus sign. Okay, I cannot explain this minus sign here. You need to do the computation. But fortunately, it works fine. So if B is equal to A squared, there is a cancellation between those two types of diagrams, and the scattering amplitude remains finite. So B is equal to 1, ensure that the theory is perturbative unitary in the sense that all the scattering amplitude remains finite and don't go with the energy. Of course, this is not the end of the story, right? Because
of course, you can get the same result just if you take standard model in Feynman gauge, for instance, and just make explicit the computation, you will get exactly the same result, right?
But here, if you want, I mean...
Yeah, but to understand slightly deeply, that's very good.
Yeah, I'll make the connection. So in a sense, I mean, if A and B are equal to 1, you can actually rewrite this Lagrangian in the standard form, which is simply d mu h squared, where h is simply this exponential I pi a sigma a over b, multiplying this and v plus h. Exactly. And you can really reconstruct this perfect square only if when a and b are equal to 1. So in a sense, I mean, people usually start from the end, they start from that, But here we have really understood, why you need the Higgs boson, why this particular coupling. It's really a fundamental property that you need the Higgs coupling to be proportional to the mass of the particle to ensure this cancellation of the scattering amplitude. Okay. Okay. So how much do we know in nature? So in nature we have certainly observed now these degrees of freedom. I mean, at the LHE again, 5 years ago, this thing was observed in various channels. So we'll discuss briefly how this Higgs boson is produced and how it decays, how you observe it in your LHE detector. So that we will come in a moment. But I mean, so far there is no precise measurement of this coupling A. We know, I mean, this thing has been measured with an accuracy which is of the order of 15%. So we know today that A is 1 plus or minus something like 15%. So we are still not sure exactly that the X that is observed exactly correspond to the standard model prediction. There is still a lot of room for deviation away from the standard model. And in particular, there is some model where the X is not an elementary particle. It will be a composite bond state in the same way that the pion of QCD are not elementary particles. The pion of QCD are made of a quark and an antiquark. So one important question is to understand whether or not the X that has been observed at the LHC is a fundamental particle, an elementary particle, or whether it is actually a composite bond state of a new quark, of a new strongly interacting theory. Right? And there are arguments, that I will explain in the next lecture, that is telling you that, most likely we don't really like very light fundamental scalar field, right? Because there is huge quantum correction associated to the mass of this Higgs boson that makes usually, an elementary scalar field very heavy. That's why, at the end of the day, the only possible scalar field, elementary scalar field that exists in nature could be the Higgs boson. That was the first time that we observed potentially an elementary scalar field. The other scalar field that you have observed in nature are all composite particles, not elementary particles. So that's why it's very important to understand whether or not Higgs is a fundamental scalar field or whether it's a composite particle. And in particular, if it's a composite particle, you expect actually some deviation to A equal 1. And that's a composite Higgs model that I will describe probably in the last lecture. So if the Higgs is a composite particle, so there is the equivalent of F5, the binding energy of the fundamental constituent of the Higgs boson, and you will expect naively that A will be equal to 1 plus the ratio of V divided by F squared. Where F is really again, the binding energy of the fundamental constituent inside the Higgs boson. So in this case, if you look at W scattering, you expect to find something like 1 minus A squared, that's what we found at the end of the day, S divided by V squared. Right? So it's only when A is equal to 1 that this scattering amplitude remains finite. When A deviates from 1, then you have a residual growth of the scattering amplitude. And now with this expression, you see that this amplitude goes like S divided by F squared. So this means that you are not losing perturbative unitarity at a scale 4 pi by B. That will be the naive scale of perturbative unitarity in absence of the Higgs boson. But this scale is actually pushed to much higher energy, which is 4 pi times F, where F is really the compositeness scale of the Higgs boson. And clearly, when you have enough energy, to see the fundamental constituent of the Higgs boson, you will also produce all the other resonances of the strong interaction, exactly like the Rho meson of QCD, for instance. Not only you are producing the pion, but you are producing all the other strong resonances, and that's the exchange of the other resonances that will take care of cancelling the scattering amplitude at energy above this scale. So how can I describe actually this composite Higgs model, into, let's say, standard SU2 cross U1 invariant theory? So you know the standard model, all the interactions, the kinetic term, the Higgs potential, so that's the Lagrangian of the standard model. And d mu h squared plus lambda, maybe with minus sign of the potential, h squared minus b squared over 2 squared. So that's the standard model Lagrangian. So now if you want to describe a composite Higgs particle, you need to introduce new interaction in addition to this standard model Lagrangian. In particular, with one term that you can write, which is a dimension 6 operator. Dimension 6 simply in mass unit, right? You have 4 power of the Higgs field and 2 derivatives. So that makes a dimension 6. So this has to be suppressed by an energy scale, which will be actually the compositeness scale of the Higgs boson, in this case, 1 over V. And there is a number for the 1 in front of this operator, so CH. So that's one example, higher dimensional operator that will capture actually the dynamics of the composite Higgs particle when you are looking at energy scale much below the compositeness scale of the Higgs boson. So that's one example, but you could also add extra operators. So for instance, you have a term which is 6 power of the Higgs boson, the correction to the Higgs potential, again suppressed by V squared. Okay, you can have coefficient C6. So how do you make the connection, between this parameterization and this one? Well, it's quite easy. You simply need to write this Lagrangian, let's say, in the unitary gauge, right? So you know, for instance, that this term will produce the usual kinetic term, d mu h, 1/2 d mu h squared, plus the term that we have written already, the mass, the 1/2 mz z mu times 1 plus h over v squared, right? So that's a standard model piece, right? So what about these extra terms here, right? D mu, so h squared in the unitary gauge, h squared is simply v plus h divided by square root of 2 times 2. So d mu h squared is 1/2 factor 2 for the derivative is v plus h times d mu h, right? So this means that in addition to the standard model Lagrangian here, you need to add a term which is ch divided by f squared times this cancel. So it's v plus h squared d mu h squared, right? Okay. So in particular, if you are looking at the kinetic term, right, and d mu h squared, but here I have a correction to the kinetic term. So this means that in this parameterization, h is actually not a canonically normalized field. So collecting, you have 1/2 of 1 plus ch v squared over f squared times d mu h squared, right? That's what you get at the quadratic level. So this means that if you want to deal with a canonically normalized field, you have to absorb this correction to the kinetic term. So you need to define h tilde, which will be canonically normalized field, which will be simply the square root of 1 plus ch v squared over f squared times h. Okay. In this case, the Lagrangian will be exactly 1/2 d mu h tilde, right? A perfectly canonically normalized field. And now you can look at the interaction of this canonically normalized field h tilde with the z boson. So here h was coupled to the z, and here there is no interaction of this x to the gauge boson, simply because this is already a gauge invariant object. So here you can have written explicitly a usual kinetic term. Right? There is no covariant derivative because this is neutral under the gauge interaction. So this means that in this Lagrangian, which is the sum of the standard model plus this higher dimensional operator, I have no new interaction between the Higgs field and the z. So you can really read off the interaction of h tilde with the z simply from this term, taking into account this new normalization factor. So in addition to this, we'll have 1/2 mz squared z mu and expand, so it's 1 plus 2h, and now you replace h by h tilde divided by v, divided by the square root of 1 plus ch v squared plus f squared plus etc. etc. Right? So So this means that in this parameterization, with the canonically normalized field, A, the coefficient A that I was introducing before, A is equal to 1 divided by the square root of 1 plus CH V squared over F squared. Which you can expand, assuming that V squared over F squared is small parameter. This is 1 plus minus CH2 V squared over F squared. So that's exactly what I was saying before. You will get some correction compared to the standard model prediction that scale like V squared over F squared.
Christopher, isn't it problem that, in fact, but you get some corrections from perturbation theory of the standard model, which is also sort of renormalization of the wave function.
Yes.
So you have, in addition to that factor,
Yes.
the other factor, which is usual normalization.
Yes.
So, what to compare to what? That correction should be compared to 1, or it should be compared to the shift in normalization because of loop corrections.
This loop correction at the end of the day is associating to the running of the coupling.
Right.
And here, I've done everything at 3 levels, so somehow I've neglected this running.
Sure. But once you do phenomenology more carefully, it should be empirical or like how?
Well, I think it depends on your. You need to define a scheme, so you need to define your renormalization condition.
Yeah.
So I guess if you are doing the experiment as a fixed energy, there is no way to distinguish this effect from the running. So you cannot make the distinction. So you need to look at an experiment at 2 different energy. Or for instance, you need to look at maybe
that's what I'm wondering.
Some distribution, that will probe the vertex between 1x and 2w at different energies. So you can look at associated production of the x with a v, with a vector boson. And in this case, you can plot the distribution as an invariant mass of the system VH, and then it will effectively probe different energy at different couplings. And here you can make clearly the distinction. Having said that, it's a question of scale. All the running, all the quantum correction that we're discussing are loop suppressed. Well, here it principally should be 3 levels.
There it's loop suppressed, but here's 1 over F suppressed. So with suppressions,
it depends.
It depends on scale.
That's what I'm saying. If indeed the composite, if the X is a composite object with a compositeness scale which is 100 TeV, most likely you will be first sensitive to the quantum correction and not
that's what I'm wondering exactly.
The question is more like whether the X is actually a composite object with a scale F which is below 1 TeV. So that's really what we are looking at the LHC.
But it could be much larger.
It could be much larger, yes, of course. Then it will be much more difficult to observe. So in principle, here you can also compute, this parameter B, just by the correction which is induced by this. If you do the computation the way I've presented it, you will find actually the wrong result, simply because there is another effect in addition to this renormalization or the normalization of the X field, is that here you have in principle some new interaction, nonlinear interaction of the X boson, right? H squared d mu squared H squared. And you can actually absorb this nonlinear interaction by performing actually a nonlinear field redefinition. So H squared plus H cubed, etc. will actually absorb all those nonlinear interaction and put again the kinetic term into the canonic form. But clearly here, since you are dealing with nonlinear field redefinition, it will affect actually the coupling at the nonlinear level. So you need really to look, if you want to look at what is the value of B, you need to perform this nonlinear field definition and take into account all these effects that are coming from H squared. And at the end of the day, what you should find, which time am I supposed to finish?
So,
5:15.
whatever.
So, okay, so A was 1, and B would be 1 minus, should be 4, CH, B squared of epsilon. I don't remember. With a factor 2 or factor 4. In such a way that really, if you're plotting, let's say, the model in terms of A and B, so you have the standard model prediction, which is A equal B equal 1, so that's really the standard model. And actually here, you have a universal deformation of the standard model in such a way that actually B is, the deviation of B away from the standard model is related to the deformation of A. So all the compositics model really sit in a line at least close to the standard model, which is predicted by this relation. So it's a universal behavior of the deformation of the standard model in let's say, in compositics model that are predicted by this dimension 6 relation. So you need And actually you can again understand this universal behavior by looking again at the custodial symmetry, which is telling you at the end of the day that you have this SO4 symmetry. The custodial symmetry is really based on the fact that you have SO4 which is broken to SO3. And this SO4 is telling you that you have a symmetry between the Higgs boson and the composant, the longitudinal composant of polarization of the W and the Z. So this means that you expect at the end of the day, in the high energy limit, when you have this SO4 symmetry, you expect to have that WW going to WW should be equal to WW close to 2 Higgs boson. You can again replace the W by the X. And I told you that this is growing like what? S divided by B squared, 1 minus A squared. And this is growing like S divided by B squared and B minus A squared. So custodial symmetry imposes somehow that 1 minus A squared should be equal to B minus A squared. And now you can actually look at the deviation away from the standard model. So A is 1 plus delta A. B is 1 plus delta B minus 1 plus delta A squared. And we do the expansion, so you get 1 minus 1 plus delta A equal 1 plus delta B minus 1 plus 2 delta A. So the 1 cancel, right? And you obtain let's do something somewhere. Should be minus sign in front of everything. Defined by delta B should be equal to 4 delta A. So that's the prediction of this SO4 symmetry. And that's somehow what you will obtain. So here it was. That's what you obtain directly by looking at this Lagrange. Okay, so I think it's probably a good point where to stop. I don't know, I could continue for 15 minutes describing a little bit the phenomenology of the Higgs boson at ZH.
Or maybe people just ask some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Just
If there is no question, I can continue for 15 minutes.
questions or?
I have a minor comment.
Yes.
Excuse me, but you have missed I in the expression for the field strength tensor in front of the T.
Yes.
Yes, and I think it's useful for the students to know that the field strength tensor is the commutator of covariant derivatives. So
Right.
if the covariant derivatives includes I, then it should also stand in the field strength tensor.
Yes, right. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, it depends a little bit on the normalization. I mean, people put this
Of course,
I in
yes,
front
but it depends on
Yes.
the covariant derivative.
there is
And
indeed.
they should be
Right.
competitive. So
There
if
is
you
one-
have I in the covariant derivative, it should be
Absolutely.
present there as well.
Right. There is always one consistency
Okay,
relation
either or.
between the term that you are writing here and the expression that you are writing for the covariant
Exactly.
derivative.
Exactly.
So as long as I'm writing only one thing, I'm never wrong. If I'm writing two things, yes, I can be wrong.
Dangerous to write two things simultaneously, right? Otherwise.
Right.
Either you work with permission matrices or without permission.
Right, absolutely. And every time you're opening two books, you will find opposite Okay, so if there is no question about what I've explained, so maybe I can spend a few minutes describing really how the Higgs boson has been observed at the LHC, so how it is produced and how it decays.
Maybe so is that the only way to go to high dimensional operators, or you can add some other terms, or just a unique way to proceed? I don't think so.
No, I mean, at the end of the day, here what you have to do is simply write all the possible higher dimensional operators that you can construct that you can construct out of the standard model field that are invariant on the SU2 plus U1. So now it depends a little bit what you're doing with the flavor indices, because in reality, in nature, the quark and the lepton belongs to three different families, so there are three flavor indices. And you can write in possible any random flavor structure for those higher dimensional operators, in particular, four Fermi interactions that are involving, let's say, four quarks or leptons. Right? So you have many, the coefficient, will have indices with four flavor indices, IJKL, let's say psi I, psi j, psi k, psi l, and I, J, K, L, in principle, can be 1, 2, or 3, right? So you end up, at the end of the day, if you really put random flavor structure, you end up with a very huge number of field of operators. That's something like 2,500 operators. But of course, many of them have been constrained by flavor data. You cannot put random flavor structure, otherwise, you end up with large FCNC, flavor changing neutral current, or large mass difference for the kaon. For instance, K bar mixing will be far too large and not compatible with experimental data. So you need to put some flavor structure. And for instance, you can assume that there is flavor universality, so everything actually is flavor universal. So here, all these coefficients of flavor have the same flavor indices. And at the end of the day, if you're doing that, you have something like 59 operators. So 59 dimension 6 operators that you can do. So here, I focus only on two particular operators, and that's the two operators that are the most relevant for compositic theory. So there are other operators, but they won't play a big role in the phenomenology of a compositic boson. So at the end of the day, what really matters is the power counting. So what is basically the scale dependence on the coefficient in front of all these dimension 6 operators. And you can write the power counting for those compositics model, which is basically the one that I've written here. So these are the operators that will be suppressed by 1 over f squared, and there will be other operators that will be suppressed, for instance, by g rho, which is a typical coupling of the strong sector, g rho squared times f squared. And if g rho is large, this will be further suppressed compared to this one. So you can neglect all those operators.
Yeah, but you may play with covariant derivatives of the H field in higher powers.
Yeah,
So
but
take the first term in fourth power, and that would be,
oh, you mean this
Yeah.
this one? Yeah.
for instance, and that would be exactly
Yeah,
the same that you did, so you just neglected something
Okay.
and you keep something, and what was behind?
So at the end of the day, if you're really looking only at X and gauge boson, you will have something like H
Just
squared
forget about fermions.
d mu H squared, so that's
Exactly.
one term.
Yeah, for instance.
There will be d mu H squared. There is this one that I've written.
Yeah.
So actually this term is violating the custodial symmetry. It's not invariant on the SU2 left plus SU2 right. So this will give rise to what we call the T parameter,
Right.
which is highly constrained by experimental data. So for instance, you can ensure that the coefficient in front of this operator is 0 simply by requiring that in physics is custodial invariant. So this is 0 here. And yes, between the two of them, you can do some field redefinition, and at the end, it's only this one that matters. But okay, we can discuss maybe later this compositic series. Well, okay, very quickly then. So how is X produced at the LHC? Well, at the end of the day, everything boils down to the fact that the X coupling are proportional to the mass of the particle. So in particular, the coupling of the X to the fundamental constituent of the proton, which are essentially the up quark and the down quark, is very small, simply because the mass of the up and the down is very small. So this means that you are not producing the X directly by colliding up and down. What you can do is having instead a coupling to the top quark. But the top quark doesn't exist in nature inside the proton. So you first need to produce the top quark, which you can do by. So inside the proton you have a lot of gluons, and the gluon produce the top quark quantum mechanically, and the top quark produce the Higgs boson via the interaction of the Yukawa interaction. So this is the main production mechanism of the Higgs boson at the LHC. With a cross section, I don't remember, of the order of 40 picovolt. So that's a cross section producing the Higgs boson. There are other mechanisms. You can produce the Higgs in association with.
You should specify the energy, otherwise it's 40 picobars.
Well, it doesn't matter, it's either 8 or 13 TeV, it doesn't vary much. With a factor 2 or factor 3 difference, but this order of magnitude. There is another production mechanism which is vector boson fusion. So by the interaction with the W and the Z, which is basically what we discussed a lot, interaction with the longitudinal component. And again, the W and the Z don't exist inside the proton, so you need to produce them. For instance, you have a proton producing a quark producing, in this case, up and down. So you have some up quarks that are producing this, maybe W plus and W minus would be more correct. Would be something so that's vector boson fusion. And the cross section is actually smaller by at least 2 orders of magnitude compared to the gluon fusion production. But here, there is different phenomena because here you expect actually to see the X in association with two jets, and these two jets actually are very forward. So there is a different way to tag this event and to disentangle it from the background. You can also produce in association with a gauge boson. So up and down, that are producing a W, usually is more like a Z. Up, W, on X. So that's association production of the X in association with the gauge boson. So this was actually a dominant production mode that was looked at lab, but you pay the price of the propagator. So when you go to high energy, this is actually
at
suppressed.
Tevatron, you don't have quark at lab.
Yeah, well, okay. You can do it with electron, it's the same thing.
That's right.
Australian production of a gauge boson.
But at Tevatron, that's for sure.
Tevatron also. But you pay a price of the propagator. So for very energetic machine like the LHE, this is not the dominant production mode. This is subdominant compared to the other. And then there is also the possibility of actually producing the X in association with a pair of top quark. So you have the gluon that produce two top. And here you can produce the X by simply the interaction of the top with X. So that's a very interesting channel, because you will have a direct access to the top Yukawa coupling here. The drawback is that the final state is very complicated. I mean, the cross-section is very small simply because you need to produce a free body. You have a free body final state. So every time you're adding an extra particle, you're paying the price of the phase space. So the cross-section is also smaller, but it's an interesting channel that people are looking at now at the LHE again, because you have a direct access to this coupling, contrary to here. Here you have access only to the coupling of the X to the top via some radiative process. And maybe in nature you have extra particle in addition to the top quark. So at the end of the day, you are not sure that you are really measuring the top Yukawa coupling when you are looking at gluon fusion production. There is some degeneracy that you have many models of new physics that will modify the top Yukawa coupling, but leave these production modes totally invariant because of the cancellation of the modified top Yukawa coupling and the new particle running into the loop. So maybe there is new physics, is such that this new physics doesn't give you any physical effect in the gluon fusion production cross-section, at least when you are looking at the inclusive cross-section. So that was for the production. So for the decay, the dominant decay actually at the end of the day is X decaying to 2B quark, because that's the largest coupling of the X to the particle. I mean, of course, the coupling of the X to the W is larger, but as I said before, because the mass of the X is smaller than twice the mass of the W, or the mass of the Z, it cannot kinematically decay into this particle. The largest decay mode is X going to 2BB bar, and the brushing ratio in this case is of the order of 60%. The problem is that it's almost impossible to see this decay at the LHE simply because you're producing a lot of P quark simply by QCD. Right? So by observing this B quark, I mean, you are not able actually to reconstruct the invariant mass of the X, so you cannot see this decay mode. And the way it has been observed actually is the decay of the X into, as I say, ZZ star. So one of the Z is off shell, and the Z decays into two leptons. So that's a clean finite state that you can easily reconstruct, and you can measure the different momentum of the four leptons, so you can reconstruct this invariant mass and really see the peak. So that was one of the main discovery mode of the LHE. And the other thing that was very clean is actually the X decay into 2 photons. Again, by a loop of top quark, also you can also have some W's. And here you observe the 2 photons. And the 2 photons is something that you can very easily reconstruct and measure. You can measure the momentum of the photons, and then you can reconstruct the invariant mass of the X and see the peak emerging out of the background. So even though here the branching ratio is very small, branching ratio is of the order of 10 to minus 4, still is something that you're able to observe in your detector simply because you are able to reconstruct your finite state. Okay, so that's basically the physics of the Higgs boson at the LHE. Okay, so
Thank you.
For electric case, what's
Because at the end of the day, I mean, well, this branching ratio is not so small, but the branching ratio of the Z to 2 lepton is at the end is small also, and you end up with something which is also of the order of 10 to minus 3, 10 to minus 4. So again, it's very few events, but those few events are very clean, and you can easily separate them from the background, from QCD.
What about decay Higgs into tau plus tau minus?
Yeah, and that's certainly a good option, which is at the end of the day, the tau is not so much lighter than the bottom, so it's also a large branching ratio. The problem is again that the decays of the taus, right? Taus are complicated leptons. It's not that clean at the end of the day to reconstruct the taus. You need to look at the various decay modes of the taus, and so you lose some sensitivity there. But nowadays, I mean, now that the statistic has improved, I think people are getting sensitive to the tau decays also.
Yeah.
So now they see
The first indications
Yes.
already.
So they start to see this thing. Even there is some limit also to the muon, to the decay between muons. And for the decay of the B, you can do that, in some very particular kinematic region when the B are very boosted. So, when they carry a lot of energy, in this case, yes, you can there is a chance to reconstruct the invariant mass and disentangle them from the background. It's complicated business, because you have some jets, so you need to reconstruct the internal structure of the jet. So it's what is called jet substructure. It's a full business that maybe Kirill will talk about. And it's a promising avenue, but it's really dirty physics.
Dirty but important.
Yeah, important. Yeah. But you have to deal with real experimental facts.
Yeah, please.
for the Davion case? Do you by any chance know how many events do you expect to get, like its current statistics or University also?
I mean, at the end of the day, the number of events that you expect is not so meaningful because you always need to put some cuts, right? So it's the number of events that you're able to reconstruct and separate from the background. So, even here, when I'm talking about the branching ratio, again, it doesn't mean a lot because you need to put some cuts to select really the event and disentangle from the background. So, yeah, I don't remember, but I mean, it's something of the order of 10 or 100 at most. At high luminosity, with all, after all the cuts.
In a fiducial volume of intent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, let's thank Christopher. So that's it for lectures today.
Yeah, today. So we'll continue tomorrow.
We will have seminars, right?
Coffee.